Sophia Bunnet was exactly 42 feet away from her apartment when the world finally broke her. The car was dead, a silent, heavy hunk of metal in the middle of Seattle's International District, and the rain was a relentless, cold weight. In her arms, 7-year-old Mia was shivering, her small face pressed into Sophia's neck, while 2 bags of groceries sat soaking on the asphalt. Sophia had spent 29 years learning how to be invisible, how to carry the weight of a world that never stopped asking for more while giving her nothing. But as she collapsed onto the wet pavement, clutching her daughter to her chest, she reached the end of her strength. What Sophia didn't know was that as she sat there, defeated by a broken alternator and a life lived on the edge, 20 cars had already swerved around her, their drivers looking through her as if she were part of the shadows. What she also didn't know was that the man in the 21st car was counting. Kang Jun-hyuk sat in the back of a black luxury sedan, watching the rain blur the neon signs of the district he ruled. He had spent a lifetime looking for defiance in desperation, and in the exhausted woman huddled on the street he found it. Sophia thought she was at her lowest point, a single mom with nothing left but a daughter she couldn't keep dry. She didn't know that her moment of total collapse had just made her the most protected person in a criminal empire she didn't even know existed. 10 minutes earlier, Sophia had been calculating the cost of a tow truck versus the cost of Mia's new winter coat, a math problem with no right answer. Now the math had changed forever. The headlights of the sedan cut through the downpour, stopping inches from where she sat. A door opened and a man stepped out, sharp, dry, and untouched by the chaos. To the rest of Seattle, he was a myth, a monster, whose name was whispered in the backrooms of the city. To Sophia, he was just the first person in 20 blocks who hadn't looked away. As Kang Jun-hyuk walked toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement, Sophia tightened her grip on Mia. She was used to being failed by men, used to being a problem for someone else to solve. She didn't know that by morning her debts would vanish, her car would be fixed, and she would be stepping into a dark fairy tale she might never be able to leave. This is her story, and it begins with a choice made in the mud. The rain was a cold, deafening roar until the heavy door of the sedan swung open, sealing out the world with a pressurized thud. Suddenly, the chaotic noise of the storm was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Sophia sat on the buttery leather of the back seat, her soaked clothes a stark, dripping insult to the pristine interior. She held Mia so tightly the girl's small breaths were the only rhythm Sophia could focus on, a fragile counterpoint to the hammering of her own heart. Across from her, Kang Jun-hyuk did not move. He didn't offer a towel and he didn't offer platitudes. He simply sat in the shadows, his presence radiating a controlled, terrifying authority that made the air in the car feel expensive and scarce. Sophia's panic was a jagged thing, a mess of what-ifs and maternal instinct screaming at her to run, even as her body finally began to stop shaking from the cold. She was a woman who had spent her life navigating the impossible choices of the working poor, but this was a different kind of danger, one that smelled like sandalwood and high-end upholstery. "You are shaking," Jun-hyuk said finally. His voice was a calm, low vibration that cut through her spiraling thoughts. It wasn't a question or an expression of sympathy. It was a clinical observation. "I can walk," Sophia managed to whisper, her voice cracking as she looked at his unreadable expression. "We don't need. I didn't ask for this." She reached for the door handle, her pride, the only thing she had ever truly owned, flaring up even as her knees felt like water. "You asked the moment you stayed on the ground," Jun-hyuk replied, his dark eyes fixing on her with a level of scrutiny that made her feel more seen than she had in 30 years. He gestured slightly with a bandaged hand, a movement that was both graceful and threatening. "The city was finished with you, Sophia. I am not." In the front seat, Choi Dong-woo watched them through the rearview mirror, his face a mask of professional indifference as he adjusted the climate control to a steady, dry heat. Sophia felt the warmth begin to seep into her bones, a predatory kind of comfort. She looked down at Mia, who had stopped shivering and was staring at the glowing dashboard with wide, curious eyes. The stakes were no longer about a broken car or a $20 safety net. They were about the soul of a mother who had just let a monster drive her home. As the car glided forward into the neon-lit Seattle night, Sophia realized the silence wasn't just peace. It was the sound of a trap closing, lined with velvet and steel. Morning light filtered through the thin, mismatched curtains of Sophia's apartment, but it didn't reveal the usual grim reality of a looming eviction. Instead, the air smelled of something impossible: fresh coffee and expensive cedar. Sophia sat up with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs as the memories of the previous night, the rain, the heavy sedan, and the man with the unreadable eyes, rushed back in a terrifying flood. She checked for Mia first, finding her daughter still deep in sleep, her small hand curled around a stuffed rabbit, safe and dry. When Sophia stepped into the kitchen, the silence of the apartment felt different, no longer heavy with the stress of survival, but charged with a new, unsettling energy. Her eyes fell on the kitchen table and she froze. Stacked neatly in the center was a pile of envelopes: her overdue electricity bill, the final notice from her landlord, and the predatory loan she'd taken out 6 months ago. Each one was stamped with a bold crimson paid mark. Her breath caught in her throat. This was a level of intervention that went beyond a simple ride home. She moved to the refrigerator, her hand trembling as she pulled the handle. The barren shelves that had held nothing but a half carton of eggs and a withered apple the night before were now overflowing. Fresh produce, organic milk, and the high-quality mochi that Mia always begged for at the market were packed into every corner. It was a miracle that felt like a threat. Sophia had spent her life being invisible, making herself smaller so as not to be a burden, but now she had been witnessed by someone with enough power to rewrite her life overnight. Finally, she saw it. Resting on the counter next to her keys was a single black business card. It was heavy, textured, and simple, with no company logo or address. Only a name and a number embossed in clean silver script: Kong Junhyuk. Holding the card felt like holding a live wire. She realized then that Junhyuk hadn't just saved her from the rain. He had dismantled her safety net of independence and replaced it with his own. The math of her life had changed. She was no longer a woman drowning in a city of millions. She was the answer to a question a monster had been asking for a long time. As Mia stirred in the next room, calling out for her, Sophia looked at the card and felt the first whisper of a truth she couldn't yet name: that being seen by a man like Junhyuk was the most dangerous gift she had ever received. Sophia clutched the black business card so tightly its sharp corners bit into her palm. She had spent the morning trying to reconcile the miracles in her kitchen with the suffocating weight of her pride. She was an Afro-American woman who had built a life out of making herself smaller and asking for nothing, and she refused to let her survival be someone else's transaction. After dropping Mia at a neighbor's, she followed the address on the back of the card to a nondescript building on the edge of the district, a place where the shadows seemed to linger even in the midday sun. The lobby was a temple of cold marble and absolute silence. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Sophia expected an office. Instead, she stepped into a theater of quiet menace. The room was expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a rain-blurred Seattle, but the view was secondary to the men gathered around a long obsidian table. They were suited men, echoes of the driver from the night before, their expressions carved from ice. At the head of the table sat Kong Junhyuk. He didn't look like the man who had sat in the shadows of a sedan. He looked like a king presiding over a crumbling world. His attention was fixed on a man at the opposite end of the table whose hands were visibly shaking. The air in the room was thick with unseen danger, a pressure that made Sophia's lungs feel tight. She had walked into the heart of a criminal empire, a reality far removed from her CNA training and her daughter's purple crayon drawings. Junhyuk's gaze shifted, catching her in the doorway. The room went silent, a dozen heads turning toward her with the synchronized precision of predators. Sophia felt the familiar urge to make herself invisible, but she looked at the paid stamps she had left on her counter and found her voice. "I can't take this," she said, her voice small but steady as she stepped forward to drop the business card and a handwritten list of her debts onto the obsidian surface. "I didn't ask you to fix my life." Junhyuk didn't stand. He didn't even blink. He simply watched her with a calm, unreadable expression that suggested he saw her defiance as the most interesting thing in the room. The high-stakes meeting, the trembling man, the cold mathematics of his business, it all seemed to fade into the background. "You think this is charity, Sophia?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "In my world there is no charity. There is only what is worth protecting." The realization hit her then, sharper than the Seattle wind. She wasn't just a woman he had helped. She had become a debt of honor in a world that didn't forgive or forget. Sophia left the obsidian-clad office with her pulse thundering, but the unseen danger didn't stay behind in the penthouse. When she reached the sidewalk, the black sedan from the night of the storm was idling at the curb, a silent sentinel against the gray Seattle skyline. The door was held open by Choi Dongwoo, the man whose face was a mask of professional indifference. He didn't ask for her destination. He simply waited with a controlled authority that made it clear her refusal was no longer a factor in the equation. The drive back to her neighborhood was different this time. Sophia watched the city through the tinted glass, realizing that the indifference of the city had been replaced by a terrifying level of attention. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Dongwoo didn't drive away. He stepped out, his eyes scanning the street with a sharp, rhythmic precision, cataloging every shadow and every passing stranger. "I can get Mia from Roses by myself," Sophia said, her voice tight with the pride and hyper-independence that had been her only armor for years. Dongwoo didn't flinch. "Mr. Kang's instructions were not to help you, Ms. Bunnet," he replied, his tone as cold and dry as the air-conditioned car. "They were to ensure that the environment remains uncomplicated." The weight of the word uncomplicated settled in Sophia's stomach like lead. She watched as Dongwoo took a position near the entrance of her building, his tense posture suggesting he was ready for a threat she couldn't even see. It was then the first whisper of understanding hit her. She wasn't just a woman who had received a miracle. She was a piece of territory. The miracles of the morning, the paid bills and the full fridge, now felt like the velvet and steel of a cage. As she climbed the stairs to retrieve Mia, she could feel Dongwoo's presence through the walls. She wasn't just being watched, she was being guarded. Jun Hyuk had placed a shield between her and the world. But as she looked at the black business card still tucked in her pocket, she wondered what would happen if the person she needed protection from most was the man who had provided the guard. The fragile peace of the park was shattered 2 days later by a voice that sounded like rusted metal and broken promises. Marcus, a ghost from Sophia's past, was waiting by the entrance of her apartment building, his eyes bloodshot and his posture aggressive. He was the kind of predatory figure who had spent years exploiting Sophia's hyper-independence, knowing she would never call the police for fear of the trouble it would bring to her doorstep. He leaned against the brickwork, blocking her path, unaware that the indifference of the city he relied on to hide his cruelty had been replaced by a terrifying level of attention. "I heard you're coming into money, Sophia," Marcus sneered, stepping into her personal space and reaching for her arm with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "You owe me for all those months I looked out for you. I'm not leaving until I get my cut." Sophia tightened her grip on Mia's hand, her maternal instinct flaring even as her heart hammered against her ribs. For a moment she felt like the invisible woman again, trapped in the cycle of impossible choices and bone-deep weariness. But the unseen danger Marcus was trying to project was nothing compared to the controlled authority that suddenly emerged from the shadows. Dongwoo appeared beside them with a sharp rhythmic movement that was as silent as it was lethal. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a bandaged hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that looked almost friendly to a casual observer but carried the weight of a criminal empire. Marcus turned to bark a curse, but the words died in his throat when he looked into Dongwoo's cold, unreadable eyes. The atmosphere became piano-heavy and melancholic, a pressurized silence where the wolf realized he had accidentally cornered a dragon. "Ms. Bunnet is under a specific kind of protection," Dongwoo said, his voice a low vibration that promised imminent consequence. "You will walk away now and you will forget this address. If you don't, the complicated business of this city will ensure you are never seen again." Marcus didn't argue. He fled into the Seattle rain, leaving Sophia standing on her porch, shivering not from fear, but from the realization of what it meant to be untouchable. She looked at Dongwoo, then down at the black business card in her pocket, feeling the velvet and steel of her new life tighten. The velvet and steel of Sophia's new life felt particularly cold the night she saw the monster behind the mask. It happened just after sunset, a cinematic noir dusk where the neon lights of the district bled into the pooling rainwater. Sophia was walking home with Mia when the black sedan didn't just idle at the curb. It was angled like a barricade against a side alley. Dongwoo was there, his controlled authority shifted into something sharper, his hand resting near the lapel of his charcoal suit in a way that signaled imminent consequence. Before Sophia could turn away, she heard a sound that didn't belong in the lavender and cedar world Junhyuk had built for her. A muffled, rhythmic thud followed by a sharp gasp of pain. Through the gap between the car and the brick wall, she saw Junhyuk. He wasn't the stranger in the expensive suit, who had looked at Mia's drawings with fragile recognition. He was the dragon. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up to reveal bruised knuckles that were no longer an accident of a fall, but the tools of a criminal empire. A man Sophia recognized, a local shopkeeper known for predatory lending, was slumped against the bins, his face a map of fear and pain. Junhyuk didn't shout. His voice remained that low vibration that had once comforted Sophia in the car, but now it sounded like the weight of lead. He was handling a threat to the neighborhood's peace with a quiet efficiency born from doing difficult things. The violence was calculated, cold, and absolute. A shadow's mercy that required a blood sacrifice. Sophia instinctively pulled Mia's head into the crook of her shoulder, shielding her from the unseen danger that had finally become visible. The miracles of the past week, the paid bills and the full fridge, suddenly felt like complicated things stained with something she couldn't wash away. She had traded her invisibility for a terrifying level of protection, but as she watched Junhyuk turn toward her, his eyes, calm and unreadable, even with blood on his cuff, she faced the ultimate moral dilemma. The secret empire wasn't just a shield, it was a monster that lived in the same space where her daughter slept. As she hurried Mia up the stairs, the silence of her lavender apartment felt like a trap closing. She had to decide if the man nobody dared to touch was truly a guardian, or if Mia was merely the most valuable person in a world that would eventually demand a price she couldn't pay. The silence of the apartment felt brittle as Sophia sat in the mismatched armchair, the black business card resting on the table like a challenge. The violence she had witnessed in the alley hung between her and the memory of the man who had shared mochi with her daughter, a moral dilemma that refused to be solved with simple math. When the knock came, it wasn't the heavy rhythmic beat of a debt collector, but a low vibration of a man who waited for permission to enter. Junhyuk stood in the doorway, the cinematic noir light of the hallway casting him in sharp relief. He looked at the paid stamps on the table, then at Sophia, his gaze calm and unreadable. He didn't apologize for the blood she had seen on his cuff. In his secret empire, truth was the only currency that mattered. He stepped into the lavender apartment, his presence making the small space feel both safer and more dangerous than it ever had. The life you are living is a series of impossible choices made in the dark, he said, his voice a steady anchor in the room's tension. He placed a heavy, cream-colored envelope on the counter. Not a check this time, but a set of keys and a deed. I am offering you a permanent way out. A home where the indifference of the city cannot reach you. A future where Mia never has to sit in the rain again. Sophia looked at the keys, then at the man who had become her shield. Her pride and hyper-independence flared, the instinct to refuse a transaction she didn't understand. But she thought of Marcus and the shopkeeper and the way the city had looked through her for 30 years. Junhyuk wasn't offering charity. He was offering a dark fairy tale, where she would no longer be the invisible woman, but someone worth protecting. It requires trust, Sophia, he added, stepping closer until she could smell the sandalwood and expensive cedar. Not trust in the empire, but trust in me. I am a monster to the world, but I have chosen to be a guardian to you. The stakes were no longer about $20 or a broken alternator. They were about the survival of her soul. To accept meant stepping into his world completely, becoming the most valuable person in a criminal empire she had once feared. Sophia looked at the keys, then up at his fragile recognition, and felt the ground shift. She realized that the monster was the only one who had truly seen her, and for the first time in her life she was ready to stop running. The transition was complete, not with a roar of violence, but with a quiet efficiency that redefined the power in the room. Sophia stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, no longer the invisible woman who made herself smaller to survive, but a woman who finally understood that her defiance and desperation was the very thing Junhyuk's secret empire lacked. 4 years Junhyuk had ruled through controlled authority and imminent consequence. but in Sophia he had found a soul that couldn't be bought or broken. A strength that didn't come from a criminal empire, but from the maternal instinct to protect what matters most. Behind her, Junhyuk watched her with an expression that was no longer unreadable or cold, but filled with a fragile recognition of a partner who had finally stepped out of the shadows. He had provided the shield, but she had provided the mercy that made the empire worth holding. The moral dilemma that had once paralyzed her had evolved into a weary solidarity. She was no longer a lamb hiding from the wolf, but a new queen who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocence of a child like Mia was to become the guardian of the storm. Outside, the Seattle rain continued to fall, but the bone-deep weariness that had once defined Sophia's life had vanished. They stood together, no longer sitting on the wet pavement or waiting for the indifference of the city to pass them by. The last $20 and the broken-down car were relics of a past life, replaced by a terrifying level of protection and a future they built on their own terms. As the neon lights of the district flickered below, Sophia looked at her reflection in the glass and didn't see a victim or a problem for someone else to solve. She saw a woman who had found her footing in a world of velvet and steel. She reached back, her hand finding Junhyuk's bruised knuckles, and for the first time they weren't just surviving the weather, they were controlling the storm, together.